Blood trickled down Katherine Norwood's face as she lay motionless in the tall prairie grass, the setting sun casting long shadows across her battered body. The distant howl of a coyote was the only sound that pierced the eerie silence of the Montana wilderness, miles from the nearest settlement. She had never imagined her husband would leave her to die alone on the unforgiving frontier, but the evidence of his cruelty was written across her skin in purple bruises and crimson wounds. Fort Benton, Montana, 1872, was not an easy place for a woman on her own, and Catherine Cady, to those who knew her before her marriage, had learned this truth the hard way. 3 years earlier, she had arrived in town full of hope, a bride of 21 years with dreams of building a life with Thomas Norwood, the handsome shopkeeper who had courted her through letters for nearly a year. His promises of prosperity and happiness had shone like gold nuggets in a stream, but like many such nuggets, they had proven to be nothing more than fool's gold. The beating that had left her unconscious in the wilderness had not been the first, but Thomas had ensured it would be the last they shared. After smashing a whiskey bottle against the kitchen table, he had used his fists with merciless precision, all because she had dared to question the lipstick smudge on his collar. When her body went limp, he had loaded her onto his wagon like a sack of flour, driven far from town, and dumped her among the tall grasses like unwanted refuse. Xavier Nash pulled his hat lower as the wind picked up, squinting against the dust that swirled across the trail. At 32, he had spent nearly half his life on horseback, working cattle drives, hunting bounties when times were lean, and generally living by a code that kept him moving from one horizon to another. His weathered face and calloused hands told the story of a man who had made peace with solitude, who found companionship in his trusted buckskin gelding, Rusty, and the vast open skies of the frontier. He was returning to Fort Benton after delivering a herd of cattle to a ranch outside of town. The payment for the job jingled in his saddlebags, enough to keep him comfortable through the winter if he was careful. Xavier had planned to spend a night or two in town before heading farther north, perhaps try his luck in the gold fields that still drew dreamers and desperate men alike. But fate had other plans for the solitary cowboy that evening. Rusty's ears pricked forward suddenly, and the horse slowed his pace, nickering softly. Xavier sat up straighter in the saddle, his right hand instinctively moving to rest on the Colt revolver holstered at his hip. Years of frontier life had taught him to trust his horse's instincts. "What is it, boy?" he murmured, scanning the surrounding prairie. The setting sun bathed the landscape in golden light, making the tall grasses shimmer like waves on an amber sea. It was a beautiful sight, but Xavier's appreciation was cut short when he spotted an unusual shape about 50 yards off the trail, something that didn't belong among the natural contours of the land. Clicking his tongue, he guided Rusty off the path and toward the disturbance. As they drew closer, Xavier's stomach tightened with dread. It was a woman's body crumpled in an unnatural position among the grasses. "Dear God," he whispered, dismounting quickly and approaching with caution, wary of a potential ambush. But there was no ambush, only a woman lying unconscious, her face battered and swollen, her simple calico dress torn and bloodied. Xavier knelt beside her, gently checking for signs of life, relieved when he felt a faint pulse at her neck. "Madam, can you hear me?" he asked, his voice gentle despite the urgency of the situation. Catherine stirred slightly, a soft moan escaping her lips, but her eyes remained closed. Xavier looked around, assessing the situation. The nearest help was Fort Benton, at least 2 hours' ride at a careful pace. Darkness would fall soon, making travel dangerous, but leaving the woman here would be a death sentence. Decision made. Xavier removed his canteen and dampened his bandana, carefully wiping away the blood from her face. As he cleaned her wounds, he spoke in a low, reassuring voice, the kind he used to calm nervous horses. "You're going to be all right, madam. I'm going to get you to town, to a doctor. You're safe now." Whether she could hear him or not, Xavier couldn't tell, but speaking the words helped steady his own nerves. This wasn't the first injured person he had encountered on the frontier, but something about the deliberate nature of her injuries made his blood boil. This wasn't the work of nature or accident. Someone had done this to her intentionally. With gentle hands, he checked for broken bones before attempting to move her. Satisfied that she could be transported, Xavier fashioned a simple travois from branches and his bedroll, securing it to Rusty's saddle. As carefully as possible, he lifted the unconscious woman and placed her on the makeshift stretcher. "Steady now, Rusty," he murmured, leading his horse back to the trail with slow, deliberate steps. "We've got precious cargo." The journey to Fort Benton seemed longer than usual, with Xavier constantly glancing back to check on his passenger. Occasionally, she would moan or stir, but consciousness eluded her. By the time the lights of the frontier town came into view, night had fallen, and Xavier's shoulders ached from the tension of the slow, careful ride. Fort Benton had grown considerably in the years since Xavier had first passed through. Once just a fur trading post, it had blossomed into a bustling river port, the uppermost navigable point on the Missouri River. Steamboats brought supplies and people from St. Louis and beyond, while traders and settlers used it as a jumping-off point for journeys deeper into the territory. Xavier headed straight for Dr. Samuel Wilson's office, located in a small white clapboard building just off the main street. Light still shone from the windows despite the late hour, a reassuring sight. "Dr. Wilson," Xavier called, tying Rusty to the hitching post before carefully lifting Katherine from the travois. "I need help." The door swung open to reveal a man in his 50s, spectacles perched on his nose, sleeves rolled up to the elbows. His eyes widened at the sight of Xavier carrying the battered woman. "Good Lord," he muttered, stepping aside to let them in. "Bring her to the examining room. Sarah." He called to his wife, who served as his nurse. "We have an emergency." Xavier laid Katherine gently on the examination table, stepping back as the doctor and his wife moved in to assess her injuries. In the lamplight, her condition looked even worse. Her face was a mosaic of bruises, her left eye swollen shut, dried blood caked in her honey blonde hair. "Where did you find her?" Dr. Wilson asked, his skilled fingers checking her pulse and pupils. Xavier removed his hat, running a hand through his dark hair. "About 2 hours east of town, just off the main trail. She was alone, unconscious." Sarah Wilson, a kind-faced woman with gray, streaked brown hair, began cutting away Katherine's torn dress to assess injuries hidden beneath the fabric. "This poor dear," she murmured, then gasped. "Samuel, look at this." The doctor's expression grew grim as he observed the pattern of bruises on Katherine's ribs and arms. "These are defensive wounds," he said quietly. Someone beat her severely, and not for the first time, judging by the older bruises. Xavier's jaw tightened. "Will she survive?" Dr. Wilson nodded slowly. "I believe so. No mortal wounds, though she has a concussion and possibly some cracked ribs. She's lost blood, is dehydrated, and will be in considerable pain when she wakes." He looked up at Xavier. "Do you know who she is?" Xavier shook his head. "Never seen her before. I'm not from these parts." "I know her," Sarah said, her voice soft with recognition. "This is Katherine Norwood. She's married to Thomas Norwood, the mercantile owner." Xavier's eyes narrowed. "Her husband did this." Sarah and the doctor exchanged a look that spoke volumes. "There have been rumors," Dr. Wilson said carefully. "Mrs. Norwood has come to me with injuries before, always accidents, she claimed. Fell down the stairs, dropped a heavy pot on herself, that sort of thing." "And you believed her?" Xavier asked, unable to keep the edge from his voice. "I'm a doctor, Mr. Nash, Xavier Nash. Mr. Nash, I treat the injuries presented to me. I cannot force a woman to admit her husband is beating her, especially when she insists otherwise." His tone was defensive, but his eyes betrayed his guilt. "The law gives a man considerable leeway in how he manages his household." Xavier's hand clenched into a fist at his side. "The law doesn't allow a man to beat his wife unconscious and leave her to die in the wilderness." "No," Dr. Wilson agreed quietly, "that it does not." Sarah placed a gentle hand on Catherine's forehead. "She's burning up. Samuel, we need to get some medicine into her." The doctor nodded, moving to a cabinet filled with various bottles and powders. "Mr. Nash, I appreciate you bringing Mrs. Norwood to us. You've likely saved her life. But there's nothing more you can do here tonight." Xavier didn't move. "I'd like to stay until she wakes up. She might be frightened, waking among strangers." Dr. Wilson seemed about to object, but Sarah interrupted. "That's considerate of you, Mr. Nash. There's a chair in the corner. I'll bring you some coffee." "Thank you, madam." As the Wilsons worked to clean Catherine's wounds and administer medicines, Xavier settled into the offered chair, his hat on his knee. He couldn't have explained why he felt so compelled to remain, why this woman's plight affected him so deeply. Perhaps it was the deliberate cruelty of the attack, or maybe it was the knowledge that the man responsible was likely sleeping peacefully while his wife fought for her life. Whatever the reason, Xavier knew with bone-deep certainty that he would not leave Fort Benton until justice was served. The night stretched long, with Katherine occasionally stirring but never fully waking. Dr. Wilson retired to his quarters upstairs after midnight, but Sarah remained, checking on her patient hourly, changing cool compresses on her forehead to combat the fever. "You should get some rest, Mr. Nash," Sarah said around 2 in the morning, bringing him a fresh cup of coffee. Xavier accepted the coffee gratefully. "I've gone longer without sleep, madam, and please call me Xavier." Sarah studied him curiously. "You're not what I expected, madam." A drifting cowboy with such a strong sense of justice, they're usually more concerned with their next drink or card game. Xavier's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "My father was a circuit judge back in Missouri. He taught me that a man's worth is measured by how he treats those weaker than himself." The smile faded. "I've seen what happens when men think their strength gives them the right to hurt others." Sarah nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Well, I'm glad Katherine had you riding by when she needed help most." As dawn broke over Fort Benton, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Katherine Norwood finally opened her eyes. Her right eye, at least the left, remained swollen shut. For a moment, she stared at the unfamiliar ceiling, confusion evident in her expression. Then memory flooded back, and she tried to sit up with a panicked gasp, only to fall back with a cry of pain. Xavier was on his feet instantly, but it was Sarah who reached Katherine first, placing gentle hands on her shoulders. "Easy, Katherine. You're safe. You're at Dr. Wilson's office." Katherine's eye darted around the room, finally landing on Xavier, who stood awkwardly at a respectful distance. Fear flashed across her face. Her voice was a croak, her throat dry from dehydration. "This is Mr. Nash," Sarah explained, helping Katherine sip water from a glass. "He found you outside of town and brought you here last night." Katherine's gaze remained fixed on Xavier, assessment replacing fear. He removed his hat, holding it respectfully. "Madam," he said simply. "Thomas." Katherine struggled to form the words, tears welling in her good eye. "Don't try to talk just yet," Sarah advised, but Katherine shook her head stubbornly. "He tried to kill me," she whispered, a single tear trailing down her bruised cheek. Xavier's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice gentle. "You're safe now, Mrs. Norwood, I promise you that." Katherine closed her eye, exhaustion evident in every line of her battered face. "No one is safe from Thomas when he's angry," she murmured before slipping back into unconsciousness. Dr. Wilson entered the room, looking refreshed after a few hours of sleep. He checked Katherine's vitals and nodded with satisfaction. "She's doing better. The fever is down and her pulse is stronger." "She woke briefly," Sarah informed him. "She said her husband tried to kill her." The doctor's expression darkened. "That changes things. If she's willing to make that accusation formally, Sheriff Jenkins can arrest Thomas Norwood." "And if she's too frightened to speak against him?" Xavier asked. Dr. Wilson sighed. "Then there's little the law can do, I'm afraid. A man's home is his castle, as they say." "Even if that man left his wife for dead in the wilderness," Xavier challenged. "That would be a crime, yes. But without Mrs. Norwood's testimony, I'll testify to what I found," Xavier interrupted. "And I'll find the spot where she was dumped. There might be tracks, evidence." Dr. Wilson regarded Xavier with newfound respect. "You seem determined to see justice done, Mr. Nash." Xavier looked at Katherine's sleeping form, something protective stirring in his chest. "Someone has to stand for those who can't stand for themselves, Doctor." After ensuring Katherine was stable, Xavier left the doctor's office, promising to return later. His first stop was the sheriff's office, a small building with a single jail cell visible through the front window. Sheriff Jenkins was a corpulent man with a walrus mustache and suspicious eyes that narrowed when Xavier entered. "Help you?" he asked, not bothering to rise from behind his desk. "Xavier Nash," he introduced himself. "I found a woman beaten nearly to death outside town last night." "Brought her to Dr. Wilson." This got the sheriff's attention. He straightened in his chair. "That's so. And who might this woman be, Katherine Norwood?" Jenkins's expression shifted, becoming guarded. "Tom Norwood's wife. You're sure about that?" Dr. Wilson and his wife identified her. "She regained consciousness briefly and said her husband tried to kill her." The sheriff stroked his mustache thoughtfully. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Nash. Thomas Norwood is a respected businessman in this town." Xavier's patience thinned. "Being respected doesn't give a man the right to beat his wife senseless and leave her to die." "Now hold on," Jenkins raised a hand. "We don't know that's what happened." "I do," Xavier countered. "I found her, Sheriff, miles from town, alone, beaten so badly she couldn't walk." "Those aren't the injuries from an accident." Jenkins sighed heavily. "Look, I've known Tom Norwood for years. He's got a temper, sure, especially when he drinks, but what?" Xavier interrupted. "You've turned a blind eye to him hurting his wife before." The sheriff's face reddened. "Watch your tone, Cowboy. You're not from around here, so I'll give you some advice. Fort Benton takes care of its own problems. We don't need drifters stirring up trouble." Xavier planted his hands on the sheriff's desk, leaning forward. "Katherine Norwood is lying in a doctor's office right now, fighting for her life. That is a problem that needs taking care of." The two men stared each other down for a long moment before Jenkins finally looked away. "Fine. I'll talk to Tom, get his side of the story, but I need Mrs. Norwood's statement before I can make an arrest." "She's barely conscious," Xavier pointed out. "Then we wait until she can speak," Jenkins replied firmly. "That's how the law works, Mr. Nash. Now, if there's nothing else." Recognizing he would get no further with the sheriff for now, Xavier left, his frustration evident in his purposeful stride. He had expected resistance. Small towns often protected their own. especially against outsiders, but the sheriff's dismissive attitude suggested something more. Perhaps Thomas Norwood's influence in Fort Benton ran deeper than just owning the mercantile. His next stop was the mercantile itself, located on the main street. Xavier entered under the pretense of needing supplies, but his real purpose was to size up Thomas Norwood. The shop was well stocked, evidence of Fort Benton's status as a trading hub, with goods ranging from practical necessities to modest luxuries. Behind the counter stood a man in his late 30s, with neatly combed brown hair and a prosperous paunch straining against his waistcoat. His smile was practiced, his manner affable as he assisted a woman selecting fabric. "Be right with you, sir," he called to Xavier, who nodded and pretended to examine a display of hunting knives. When the woman departed, Thomas Norwood approached Xavier with a shopkeeper's professional warmth. "What can I help you with today, stranger?" Xavier met the man's eyes directly. "Just passing through. Need some coffee and tobacco." Of course. We've got the finest in the territory." Norwood turned to retrieve the items, and Xavier noted the man's knuckles scraped and bruised, consistent with someone who had recently been in a fight or beaten his wife. As Norwood measured coffee beans into a paper sack, Xavier casually asked, "Quiet day today?" "Reasonably so," Norwood replied. "My wife usually minds the store in the mornings, but she's visiting her sister in Helena." The lie came smoothly, without a hint of discomfort. "Leaves me short-handed, but family comes first, wouldn't you agree?" Xavier's stomach turned at the man's casual deception, but he forced a neutral expression. "Family's important," he agreed, laying coins on the counter. "When do you expect Mrs. Norwood back?" A flicker of something annoyance, suspicion, crossed Norwood's face. "Hard to say. Women's visits tend to stretch longer than planned." He handed over the purchases with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You planning to stay in Fort Benton long?" "Depends," Xavier replied evenly. "Might have business that needs attending to." Norwood's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Well, Fort Benton welcomes honest men looking for honest work. Good day to you, sir." Xavier tipped his hat and left the store, his assessment complete. Thomas Norwood was a practiced liar, a man accustomed to controlling his image in public while harboring darker tendencies in private. Such men were dangerous, especially when cornered. Returning to the doctor's office, Xavier found Katherine awake again, propped up slightly on pillows. The swelling in her face had reduced somewhat, though the bruising had darkened to deep purple. "Doctor." Wilson was absent, but Sarah sat beside the bed, helping Katherine sip broth from a spoon. Both women looked up when Xavier entered. Katherine seemed more alert now, her blue eye tracking his movement across the room. "Mr. Nash," Sarah greeted him. "Katherine has been asking about you." Xavier approached the bed, hat in hand. "Madam, it's good to see you awake." Katherine set aside the broth with a shaky hand. "Mrs. Wilson told me what you did," she said, her voice stronger than it had been earlier but still raspy. "Thank you for saving my life." "Anyone would have done the same," he responded, uncomfortable with her gratitude. A sad smile touched her swollen lips. "No, Mr. Nash, not anyone." Her good eye held his for a moment before dropping to her hands, which lay clasped in her lap. The left one bore a simple gold wedding band. Has anyone told Thomas where I am?" Xavier exchanged a glance with Sarah before answering carefully. "I spoke with Sheriff Jenkins this morning. He said he would talk to your husband." Fear flashed across Katherine's face. "Thomas will come for me. He'll be furious." "He won't hurt you again," Xavier assured her, his voice firm. "The sheriff needs your statement about what happened." Katherine's fingers twisted the wedding band anxiously. "Sheriff Jenkins and Thomas are friends. They play poker together every Saturday night." Xavier wasn't surprised by this revelation, given the sheriff's reluctance to act. "Mrs. Norwood, I know it's frightening, but if you don't speak up, your husband won't face consequences for what he did." Tears welled in her eye. "You don't understand. No one ever does. Thomas is important in this town. People respect him. They would never believe. They'll believe the evidence of their own eyes," Xavier interrupted gently, gesturing to her injuries. "And they'll believe me when I tell them where I found you." Katherine fell silent, conflict evident on her face. Sarah patted her hand sympathetically. "You don't need to decide anything right now, dear. You need rest to heal." Xavier recognized the wisdom in Sarah's words. Pushing Katherine too hard, too soon would only add to her trauma. "Mrs. Wilson is right. I just wanted to check on you and let you know you're not alone in this." Katherine studied him with her good eye. "Why do you care so much, Mr. Nash? You don't know me." It was a fair question, one Xavier had asked himself. "My mother died when I was 12, he said after a moment. "My father remarried a year later. My stepmother was a kind woman, but her first husband had been cruel. I remember seeing the fear in her eyes whenever a man raised his voice, how she flinched at sudden movements." He met Katherine's gaze steadily. "No one helped her then. I can help you now." Something shifted in Katherine's expression, a softening, a tentative trust. "Thank you," she whispered. Xavier nodded, replacing his hat. "I should let you rest. I'll return later if that's all right." "Please do," Katherine replied, surprising both herself and him with the quickness of her response. As Xavier turned to leave, the door to the doctor's office burst open, and Thomas Norwood stormed in, his face flushed with rage or alcohol, possibly both. Sheriff Jenkins followed close behind, looking uncomfortable but making no move to restrain the irate husband. "Katie," Norwood boomed, pushing past Xavier to approach the bed. Katherine shrank back against the pillows, naked terror on her face. "My God, look at you." "Sheriff Jenkins told me you were attacked on the road." The performance was masterful, Xavier had to admit. Norwood projected the perfect blend of concern and outrage, his eyes widening with apparent shock at his wife's condition. "Who did this to you, darling? Tell me and I'll make them pay." Katherine's eye darted from her husband to Xavier to the sheriff, like a trapped animal seeking escape. Thomas," Sarah intervened, stepping between him and the bed. "Katherine needs rest. She's been through a terrible ordeal." Norwood barely acknowledged her, his attention fixed on his wife. Of course. But surely she can tell us what happened. Who attacked her?" Xavier moved to stand beside Sarah, creating a buffer between Norwood and Katherine. "I think it's clear what happened, Mr. Norwood." Norwood turned to Xavier, taking his measure with cold eyes despite the concerned expression he maintained. "And who might you be, Xavier Nash? I found your wife unconscious in the prairie grass, beaten nearly to death." "And I'm eternally grateful to you, Mr. Nash," Norwood said smoothly. "But I'm confused. You say it's clear what happened, yet my wife hasn't said who attacked her." Xavier held Norwood's gaze. "The bruises on her face match the marks on your knuckles." The room went deadly silent. Sheriff Jenkins shifted uncomfortably by the door, while Sarah drew a sharp breath. Norwood's mask of concern slipped for just a moment, revealing the rage beneath, before he composed himself again. "That's an outrageous accusation," he said, his voice dangerously low. "I caught my hand in a door yesterday. Isn't that right, Sheriff?" Jenkins nodded reluctantly. "Tom showed me his hand this morning when I went to inform him about his wife, said it was an accident." "And you believed him?" Xavier challenged. "Now see here," Jenkins bristled. "You're crossing a line, Nash." "Thomas," Katherine's voice was small but clear. "Please leave." All eyes turned to her. She was trembling visibly, but there was determination in her gaze. Norwood's expression darkened. Katie, you're confused, darling. You've had a terrible shock. Let me take you home where I can care for you properly. No. The single word seemed to cost Katherine tremendous effort. I'm staying here. This is ridiculous, Norwood turned to the sheriff. Jenkins, my wife is clearly not in her right mind. I have the right to take her home. Jenkins rubbed his neck uncomfortably. Well, legally speaking, yes, but Katherine is my patient. Dr. Wilson's authoritative voice cut through the tension as he entered from a back room. And in my medical opinion, she is not to be moved. Not today, not tomorrow. He crossed to stand with his wife and Xavier, forming a united front. Sheriff, I must insist you remove Mr. Norwood from my office. He is distressing my patient. Norwood's facade cracked further. You can't keep my wife from me. I have rights. And she has the right not to be beaten unconscious, Xavier replied evenly. Norwood took a menacing step forward, but Jenkins finally intervened, placing a hand on his arm. Tom, let's step outside and cool down. The doc's right, Katie needs rest. You can come back tomorrow when everyone's calmer. For a moment, it seemed Norwood might refuse, might launch himself at Xavier or worse, at Katherine. But awareness of witnesses apparently penetrated his anger, and he allowed the sheriff to guide him toward the door. This isn't over, he hissed, glaring first at Xavier, then at his wife. You're my wife, Katie, remember that. When the door closed behind the two men, Katherine collapsed back against the pillows, tears streaming from her good eye. He'll come back, she whispered. He always comes back. Dr. Wilson checked her pulse, frowning at its rapid pace. Sarah, prepare a mild sedative. Mrs. Norwood needs to rest. Xavier moved closer to the bed. Mrs. Norwood, Katherine, I meant what I said. He won't hurt you again. Katherine looked at him through her tears, wanting desperately to believe him but conditioned by years of abuse to expect the worst. You don't know him like I do, Mr. Nash. When Thomas wants something, he takes it, and he considers me his property. Not anymore, Xavier promised, his voice low and fervent. Not anymore. After Katherine had been given the sedative and drifted into sleep, Dr. Wilson pulled Xavier aside. You've made a dangerous enemy today, Mr. Nash. Thomas Norwood has influence in this town. Sheriff Jenkins won't cross him without overwhelming evidence. Then we'll get that evidence, Xavier replied. Can I count on your support, Doctor? Your testimony about Katherine's injuries? Wilson nodded firmly. You can. I should have spoken up the first time she came to me with suspicious injuries, but I convinced myself it wasn't my place. I was wrong. He glanced at Katherine's sleeping form. What's your plan? Xavier considered the question carefully. First, we need to ensure Katherine's safety. Norwood won't give up easily. Then, I need to find proof of what he did, tracks where he left her, witnesses who might have seen something. And if you find such proof, then we force Sheriff Jenkins to do his job, Xavier said grimly. Or find someone who will. Over the next few days, a pattern established itself. Xavier would spend mornings searching the area where he had found Katherine, looking for evidence. He discovered the wagon tracks where Thomas had stopped to discard his wife, and even found a broken whiskey bottle with blood on the glass, confirming Katherine's account of how the beating began. Afternoons and evenings, he would return to the doctor's office, where Katherine was slowly regaining her strength. At first, their conversations were brief and stilted, with Katherine still wary and Xavier uncertain how to interact with the traumatized woman. But gradually, a tentative friendship formed. Katherine shared small details about her life, how she had grown up in St. Louis, the daughter of a schoolteacher, how she had been wooed by Thomas through correspondence after her father died, leaving her with few prospects. How the charming man who had met her stagecoach had transformed into a monster within months of their marriage. The first time he hit me, I was so shocked I couldn't speak, she confided one evening, sitting in a chair by the window, her face healing but still marked by fading bruises. He apologized afterward, cried, swore it would never happen again. I believed him. Xavier, seated across from her, listened intently. It's not your fault, he said. Men like that are masters of manipulation. Catherine's fingers worried at a loose thread on her borrowed nightgown. I tried to leave once, about a year ago. Packed a bag while he was at the store, took what little money I had saved, got as far as the stage-coach office. A bitter smile touched her lips. The ticket agent was a friend of Thomas's. He stalled me, sent word to the store. Thomas came and escorted me home, smiling and making jokes about women's poor sense of direction. Her voice dropped to a whisper. He broke my wrist that night, told me if I ever tried to leave again, he'd break my neck. Xavier's hand clenched on the arm of his chair, but he kept his voice even. This time will be different. Katherine looked up, meeting his eyes directly. Because of you. The simple statement hung between them, laden with meaning neither was ready to examine too closely. Thomas Norwood, meanwhile, had not remained idle, prevented from seeing Katherine by Dr. Wilson's medical authority. He had launched a campaign to discredit both the doctor and Xavier. Rumors circulated through Fort Benton that Xavier was a wanted criminal hiding from the law, that Dr. Wilson was keeping Katherine sedated against her will, that the whole situation was a scheme to extort money from a respected businessman. Sheriff Jenkins remained frustratingly neutral, unwilling to arrest Norwood without Katherine's direct accusation, but equally unwilling to force her return to her husband while she was under a doctor's care. The situation came to a head on the 5th day after Xavier had found Katherine. Dr. Wilson entered the room where Xavier and Katherine were sharing a quiet lunch, his expression grave. Thomas has filed a legal petition, he announced without preamble. He's claiming I'm holding his wife against her will, and that Mr. Nash is attempting to alienate his wife's affections. Katherine's spoon clattered to her plate. What does that mean? It means, Wilson said heavily, that unless you formally accuse your husband of assault, Judge Parker will likely order you returned to his custody within 2 days. Xavier stood abruptly. That's ridiculous. Look at her. The evidence of what he did is written all over her body. Injuries that could have been caused by an unknown assailant, Wilson pointed out grimly. Without Katherine's testimony, we have only circumstantial evidence. Katherine's hands trembled in her lap. If I testify against him, he'll kill me. Maybe not immediately, but eventually, and he might hurt you all too. Xavier knelt beside her chair, taking one of her trembling hands in his. Katherine, listen to me. You're stronger than you know. I've seen it every day as you've fought to recover. And you're not alone anymore. Tears welled in her eyes. I'm so afraid. I know, he acknowledged softly, but sometimes the only way past fear is through it. She studied his face, finding nothing but sincerity in his steady gaze. What if it's not enough? What if the judge doesn't believe me? Then we'll find another way, Xavier promised. But first, we have to try this way. Katherine took a deep, shuddering breath, squeezing his hand. All right, I'll testify, Doctor. Wilson left to inform Sheriff Jenkins of Katherine's decision, while Xavier remained at her side, offering quiet support as she wrestled with her fear. Tell me about your life, she requested suddenly. Before Fort Benton, who is Xavier Nash when he's not rescuing battered women? The question surprised a smile from him. Not much to tell. I grew up in Missouri, as I mentioned. After my father died, I headed west. Worked cattle drives, did some bounty hunting, tried my hand at prospecting. Never stayed in one place too long. No family, no sweetheart waiting somewhere. He shook his head. Never found the right time or place to settle down. Or the right person? Katherine asked softly. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, a current of connection neither had anticipated but both increasingly recognized. Maybe I wasn't looking in the right places, Xavier said, his voice low. A flush colored Katherine's healing cheeks, and she looked down at their still joined hands. I never thought I could feel safe with a man again, she admitted. But with you. The door opened before Xavier could respond, and Sheriff Jenkins entered, followed by Dr. Wilson. Jenkins removed his hat, looking uncomfortable but determined. Mrs. Norwood, the doctor tells me you're ready to make a statement about what happened. Katherine straightened in her chair, drawing strength from Xavier's presence. Yes, Sheriff, I am. Jenkins produced a small notebook and pencil. I need to hear exactly what happened in your own words. Taking a deep breath, Katherine began. She spoke of the whiskey bottle, the accusation about the lipstick stain, the brutal beating that followed. She described how Thomas had loaded her unconscious body into his wagon, driven her miles from town, and discarded her like garbage in the tall grass. He meant for me to die out there, she concluded, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. He told me so while he was hitting me, said it was time I disappeared for good. Jenkins wrote everything down, his expression growing increasingly troubled. When Katherine finished, he closed his notebook and cleared his throat. Mrs. Norwood, these are serious accusations. You understand I'll need to arrest your husband based on this statement. I understand, she replied. And I'll testify to everything I've said in court. Jenkins nodded solemnly. I'll go now and bring him in. Dr. Wilson, I trust Mrs. Norwood will remain here until the hearing, of course, Wilson agreed. As Jenkins departed, Katherine sagged in her chair, emotionally exhausted. Xavier knelt beside her again, offering a handkerchief for her tears. You did well, he told her. Very well. She attempted a smile. It's just the beginning, isn't it? Yes, he acknowledged, but it's a beginning you control, not him. That night, Xavier insisted on staying at the doctor's office, concerned that Thomas might attempt to reach Katherine before the sheriff could arrest him. His instinct proved correct. Shortly after midnight, a noise at the back door alerted Xavier, who had been dozing in a chair. Moving silently, he positioned himself in the shadows as the door eased open. Thomas Norwood slipped inside, a hunting knife gleaming in his hand. I knew you'd try something like this, Xavier said. Stepping into view with his revolver drawn, Norwood froze, his face contorting with rage. You, he spat. This is all your fault. She would never have defied me if you hadn't poisoned her mind against me. Katherine made her own decision, Xavier replied evenly. She's not your property, Norwood. She's a person who deserves better than what you gave her. Norwood's grip tightened on the knife. She's my wife. What happens between us is none of your business. You made it my business when you left her to die where I would find her. Xavier's revolver remained steady, aimed at Norwood's chest. Drop the knife. For a moment it seemed Norwood might lunge forward, might choose violence over surrender. Then the fight seemed to drain from him, and the knife clattered to the floor. You think this is over? Norwood laughed bitterly. The judge will never convict me. My word against a woman's and a drifter's. I'll be home by supper time tomorrow. We'll see about that, Xavier said, gesturing with the revolver. Move, slowly. We're going to the sheriff's office. Under Xavier's watchful eye, Norwood walked through the darkened streets to the jail where a surprised Sheriff Jenkins took him into custody. Found him breaking into the doctor's office with a knife, Xavier explained. Seems he didn't want to wait for his day in court. Jenkins looked deeply troubled as he locked Norwood in the cell. This complicates things, he admitted to Xavier. Breaking and entering, carrying a weapon. Judge Parker will have to take that into account. Along with the attempted murder of his wife, Xavier reminded him pointedly. Jenkins nodded slowly. Along with that, yes. Word spread quickly through Fort Benton the next morning. Thomas Norwood, respected businessman and prominent citizen, had been arrested for attempting to kill his wife. The town divided into factions: those who had suspected Norwood's true nature for years, and those who refused to believe a man of his standing could be guilty of such crimes. The hearing was scheduled for 2 o'clock in the town hall, with Judge Parker presiding. As the appointed hour approached, Xavier escorted Katherine from the doctor's office, Sarah Wilson walking on her other side. Katherine wore a borrowed dress, her face still showing faint bruises but her head held high despite her obvious nervousness. "Remember, just tell the truth," Xavier advised her as they climbed the steps to the town hall. "Your truth has power." Katherine nodded, her hand finding his for a brief, reassuring squeeze before they entered the crowded room. Judge Parker, a stern-faced man with a reputation for fairness, called the hearing to order. Thomas Norwood sat at one table with a hastily arranged lawyer, while Katherine was guided to the other. Xavier took a seat directly behind her, close enough that she could feel his supportive presence. The proceedings moved quickly. Sheriff Jenkins presented the evidence: Katherine's statement, Xavier's testimony about finding her, Dr. Wilson's medical assessment of her injuries, and the damning fact of Norwood's midnight raid on the doctor's office. When Katherine's turn came to testify, she spoke clearly despite her obvious fear, her voice growing stronger as she recounted 3 years of escalating abuse culminating in the brutal attack that had nearly claimed her life. "He said I wouldn't be missed," she concluded, looking directly at her husband for the first time since entering the room. "He was wrong." Thomas Norwood's defense consisted mainly of character witnesses, business associates, and poker buddies who attested to his good nature, and his own testimony, in which he claimed Katherine had been unfaithful, that she had attacked him first, that her injuries must have been caused by another man. But his story fell apart under Judge Parker's incisive questioning, especially when confronted with the evidence of his midnight attempt to reach Katherine with a knife. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the town hall windows, Judge Parker delivered his verdict. Thomas Norwood was found guilty of assault and attempted murder. His sentence: 15 years in the territorial prison at Deer Lodge. "No," Norwood shouted, lunging across the table toward Katherine. "You lying whore, I'll kill you for this." Sheriff Jenkins and his deputy restrained the enraged man, dragging him from the hall as he continued to hurl threats and obscenities. Katherine remained seated, pale but composed, until the doors closed behind her husband. Only then did she allow herself to tremble, to accept the comforting arm Xavier placed around her shoulders. "It's over," he murmured. "He can't hurt you anymore." But they both knew it wasn't truly over. Katherine had her freedom, but her future remained uncertain. As a woman alone in the frontier, with no money of her own and a reputation now inextricably linked to scandal, her options were limited. Dr. and Mrs. Wilson offered her continued shelter while she recovered fully, an offer Katherine gratefully accepted. Xavier, meanwhile, found himself reluctant to leave Fort Benton as he had originally planned. He told himself he was merely ensuring Katherine's continued safety, but in his heart, he knew there was more to it. In the days following the trial, he found reasons to visit the doctor's office daily, bringing small gifts, wildflowers gathered from the prairie, a book he thought she might enjoy, fresh baked goods from the town bakery. Katherine welcomed his visits with increasing warmth, her smile becoming less hesitant, her laughter more frequent as she healed both physically and emotionally. 2 weeks after the trial, Xavier arrived to find Katherine sitting on the small porch behind the doctor's office, her face tilted toward the sun. The bruises had faded almost completely, revealing a natural beauty that had been masked by pain and fear when he first found her. "Good morning," he greeted her, hat in hand. Katherine smiled, genuine pleasure lighting her eyes. "Xavier, I was hoping you'd come by today." He settled into the chair beside her, enjoying the simple comfort of her presence. "How are you feeling?" "Better, doctor. Wilson says I've made a remarkable recovery." She hesitated, then added, "Physically, at least." Xavier understood the unspoken admission that the emotional wounds would take longer to heal. "One day at a time," he said gently. Katherine nodded, her gaze moving to the distant horizon. "I've been thinking about what comes next. I can't impose on the Wilsons forever." "Have you decided anything?" "Sheriff Jenkins says the mercantile legally belongs to me now, as Thomas's wife, since he's imprisoned. I could sell it, use the money to start fresh somewhere else." She glanced at Xavier. "Somewhere no one knows me as Thomas Norwood's battered wife." The thought of Katherine leaving Fort Benton created an unexpected ache in Xavier's chest. "Where would you go?" "I don't know. Back east, perhaps, or to California." She smiled wistfully. "Somewhere near the ocean. I've always wanted to see it." Xavier nodded, trying to ignore his disappointment. "That sounds like a fine plan." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching clouds drift across the Montana sky. Finally, Katherine spoke again, her voice soft but determined. "Xavier, there's something I need to say." She turned to face him fully. "I owe you my life, not just because you found me that day, but because you gave me the courage to stand up for myself, to believe I deserved better." "You always deserved better," he replied simply. Katherine's eyes softened. "I know that now." She reached for his hand, her touch tentative but deliberate. "I also know that I've come to care for you more than I thought possible after everything that happened." Xavier's heart quickened at her words, at the feel of her hand in his. "Katherine, please let me finish. I'm not asking anything of you. I know you have your own life, your own path. But before I make decisions about my future, I needed you to know." Xavier turned his hand to clasp hers more firmly. "My path has felt clearer these past weeks than it has in years," he admitted. "And it's because of you." Hope blossomed in Katherine's eyes. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I don't want you to leave Fort Benton, at least, not without me." The words came easier than he had expected, truth flowing from a place in his heart he had kept guarded for too long. "I'm saying I care for you too, Katherine, more than I thought possible." A smile broke across her face, radiant despite the tears that welled in her eyes. "I was so afraid to hope," she whispered. Xavier reached out, gently brushing a tear from her cheek. "Hope is the one thing no one can take from us," he said softly. "Not if we don't let them." Katherine leaned into his touch, her eyes holding his. "What happens now?" "Now," Xavier smiled. "Now we take things slowly. Get to know each other properly without fear or crisis hanging over us. And when you're ready, truly ready, we'll decide together what comes next." "Together," Katherine repeated, as if testing the word. "I like the sound of that." In the weeks that followed, Xavier and Katherine built something neither had expected to find in Fort Benton, a relationship founded on mutual respect and genuine affection. Xavier helped Katherine manage the sale of the mercantile to a young couple from Minnesota, ensuring she received a fair price. Katherine, in turn, encouraged Xavier to consider settling down, perhaps investing in a small ranch outside of town. By the time autumn painted the surrounding hills in gold and crimson, they had established a comfortable routine. Xavier had taken a job with a local cattle operation, while Katherine had begun assisting at the small school, discovering a talent for teaching she had inherited from her father. They courted properly, under the approving eyes of the Wilsons, and the increasingly supportive townsfolk of Fort Benton. Xavier was careful never to rush Katherine, understanding that the wounds inflicted by Thomas Norwood went deeper than the physical injuries that had healed. On a crisp October evening, Xavier took Katherine for a ride along the Missouri River, to a spot where the water widened and slowed, reflecting the sunset in shimmering glory. They dismounted and spread a blanket on a grassy knoll overlooking the water. "It's beautiful," Katherine sighed, leaning comfortably against Xavier's shoulder as they watched the sun sink toward the horizon. "I never really appreciated how beautiful Montana could be until recently." Xavier smiled, his arm around her waist. "Beauty is easier to see when your eyes aren't clouded by fear," she nodded, thoughtful. "I used to dream about escaping, about running as far as I could from this place. Now—" She turned to look at him. "Now I can't imagine being anywhere else." Xavier's heart swelled with emotion. Over the past months, he had watched Katherine transform from a terrified victim into a strong, confident woman who faced each day with courage and optimism. Her resilience humbled him, her growing affection for him a gift he had never expected to receive. "Katherine," he said, taking her hands in his, "I've been thinking about the future, our future." A warm smile touched her lips. "Have you?" "I have." He took a deep breath, suddenly nervous despite the certainty in his heart. "I know it might seem soon, given everything you've been through, and I'll understand if you need more time. But I want you to know that I love you, and if you'll have me, I want to spend my life making sure you never have reason to be afraid again." Katherine's eyes widened, her hands tightening around his. "Xavier, are you asking?" He nodded, reaching into his pocket to withdraw a small velvet box. "I'm asking if you'll marry me, Katherine. Not because you need protection or because it's what's expected, but because I can't imagine my life without you in it." Tears filled Katherine's eyes as Xavier opened the box to reveal a delicate silver ring set with a small but perfect sapphire. "It's not fancy," he apologized. "But when I saw it, it reminded me of your eyes." "It's perfect," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "And yes, Xavier Nash, I will marry you, because I love you and because you showed me what love is supposed to be." Xavier slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly, then gathered her into his arms, his kiss a promise of all the days to come. They were married on Christmas Eve in Dr. Wilson's parlor, with Sarah serving as matron of honor and Sheriff Jenkins, now a firm ally and friend, standing as best man. The small ceremony was attended by the handful of people who had supported Katherine during her darkest days, people who had come to respect and admire the quiet strength of the woman who had refused to remain a victim. Xavier had purchased a modest ranch 10 miles outside of Fort Benton, using his savings and a portion of Katherine's money from the sale of the mercantile. The small house was simple but comfortable, with wide windows that let in abundant light and views of the rolling prairie. It was to this home that Xavier brought his bride after the wedding, carrying her across the threshold despite her laughing protests. "Welcome home, Mrs. Nash," he said, setting her gently on her feet in the parlor, where a fire crackled cheerfully in the hearth. Katherine looked around the room, taking in the comfortable furnishings, the books she had selected arranged on shelves, the Christmas greenery she had helped hang the previous day. "Home," she repeated softly. "I never thought I'd feel that word again." Xavier brushed a strand of honey blonde hair from her face, his touch gentle. "Feel it now," she smiled up at him, love shining in her eyes. "Yes, it feels like coming home after a very long journey." That night, Xavier showed Katherine what love between a man and a woman was meant to be: tender, respectful, joyful. And Katherine discovered that her body could be a source of pleasure rather than pain, that intimacy could bring connection rather than fear. As they lay together in the quiet darkness, Catherine's head pillowed on Xavier's chest. She whispered, "Thank you for finding me." Xavier pressed a kiss to her forehead. "I think perhaps we found each other exactly when we needed to." Spring brought new beginnings to the Nash ranch. The cattle Xavier had invested in thrived on the lush prairie grass. The small vegetable garden Catherine planted began to sprout, and the wildflowers that had once hidden her broken body now carpeted the hillsides in vibrant color. And with spring came another joy, the knowledge that their family would grow before the year was out. When Catherine shared the news of her pregnancy, Xavier's whoop of delight could have been heard clear to Fort Benton. "Are you happy?" she asked unnecessarily, laughing as he swung her in a gentle circle. "Happier than I ever thought possible," he assured her, setting her carefully on her feet. "Are you?" Catherine placed his hand on her still flat stomach, her eyes shining. "Completely. I finally understand what my father meant when he said that love multiplies rather than divides. I didn't think I could love you more than I already did, but knowing we've created this new life together." Xavier knelt before her, pressing a reverent kiss to her abdomen. "Hello in there, little one," he murmured. "Your mama and I can't wait to meet you." Catherine ran her fingers through his dark hair, her heart overflowing with gratitude for this man who had not only saved her life, but had given her a reason to live it fully. The months of Catherine's pregnancy passed in a haze of joyful anticipation. Xavier insisted on hiring help for the heavier ranch work so he could be near Catherine, his protective instincts heightened by her condition. Catherine, for her part, bloomed like the wildflowers she loved, her body changing to accommodate the growing child, her spirit continuing to heal from the wounds of her past. Thomas Norwood's shadow grew fainter with each passing day, though occasionally Catherine would wake from a nightmare, her heart racing with remembered terror. On those nights, Xavier would hold her close, murmuring reassurances until her breathing steadied and she returned to peaceful sleep. "He can't hurt us," Xavier would remind her. "He's locked away for many years to come." "I know," Catherine would reply, settling back into his embrace. "And even if he weren't, I'm not afraid anymore, not when I'm with you." On a crisp November morning, almost exactly a year after Xavier had found Catherine broken and abandoned in the tall grass, their son was born after a long but uncomplicated labor. Dr. Wilson, who had traveled from Fort Benton for the birth, placed the squalling infant in Xavier's arms with a broad smile. "Congratulations, Mr. Nash. You have a fine, healthy boy." Xavier stared down at the tiny red face, overwhelmed by the surge of love that washed through him. Carefully, he brought the baby to Catherine, who reached for her son with tears of joy streaming down her face. "Hello, my darling," she whispered, counting his fingers and toes with wonder. "Welcome to the world." They named him Samuel after Dr. Wilson, whose kindness had helped make their happiness possible. Samuel Nash had his father's dark hair and his mother's blue eyes, and from his earliest days, a smile that could melt the coldest heart. As winter settled over the Montana territory, the Nash family found contentment in their snug ranch house. Xavier would often pause in the doorway of the parlor, watching Catherine sing softly to their son as she rocked him before the fire, and marvel at how completely his life had changed in the space of a year. Gone was the drifting cowboy with no fixed purpose. In his place stood a husband, a father, a man with deep roots and deeper joys. And in Catherine's eyes, he saw not the haunted fear that had clouded them when they first met, but a serene happiness that matched his own. "What are you thinking about?" Catherine asked one evening, catching his contemplative gaze. Xavier crossed the room to kneel beside her chair, one hand resting on their sleeping son, the other taking hers. I was thinking about how life has a way of giving us exactly what we need, even when we don't know we need it. Katherine smiled, understanding immediately. I needed a rescuer, she said softly, and you needed someone to rescue. We rescued each other, Xavier corrected gently. You gave me purpose, a home, a family, things I didn't even know I was missing until I found you. And you gave me back myself, Katherine replied, the self I thought was lost forever. Xavier lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her wedding ring. Not lost, he murmured. Just waiting to be found. As little Samuel stirred in his mother's arms, opening his blue eyes to gaze solemnly at his father, Xavier made a silent promise to his son, to Katherine, to himself, that he would spend the rest of his days ensuring that the love that had blossomed from tragedy would continue to grow, to thrive, to multiply. For in the vast, wild territory of Montana, where danger and beauty existed side by side, Xavier Nash had discovered the greatest treasure of all, a love strong enough to heal past wounds and brave enough to face whatever the future might bring. And as he gazed at his wife and son, bathed in the golden glow of the hearth fire, Xavier knew with bone-deep certainty that he had finally found his true home not in a place, but in the hearts of those he loved. Years passed, and the Nash ranch prospered. Samuel grew into a strong, kind-hearted boy with his father's quiet confidence and his mother's gentle spirit. When he was 4, a sister joined the family, Elizabeth, named for Katherine's mother, a bright-eyed girl with a laugh that rang across the prairie like silver bells. Xavier expanded their herd, built a larger barn, added rooms to the house as their family grew. Katherine planted an orchard that, in time, produced apples sweet enough to win prizes at the Fort Benton Harvest Festival. Together, they created a home known for its warmth and hospitality, a safe haven for travelers and a gathering place for friends. They never spoke of Thomas Norwood to their children, though as Samuel and Elizabeth grew older, they occasionally heard whispers in town fragments of a story about their mother's first husband, a man whose cruelty had become legendary in Fort Benton. But these whispers held no power over the Nash family, whose foundation was built on love rather than fear. When Samuel was 12 and Elizabeth 8, Katherine received word that Thomas had died in prison, victim of a fever that had swept through Deer Lodge. She read the letter alone on the front porch, and when Xavier found her there, he couldn't tell if the moisture on her cheeks was from tears or the light spring rain that had begun to fall. "Are you all right?" he asked, sitting beside her. Katherine folded the letter carefully. "Yes," she said, and meant it. "I feel free, truly free for the first time." She looked at Xavier, her blue eyes clear and peaceful. "Is it wrong to feel relief that he's gone?" Xavier took her hand, the same hand he had held through childbirth and illness, through joy and occasional sorrow, through all the ordinary moments that made up their extraordinary life together. "No," he said simply. "It's human." Katherine leaned against his shoulder, watching as Samuel taught Elizabeth to throw a lasso in the yard, their children's laughter a balm to any lingering shadows from the past. "We've been blessed, haven't we?" "Beyond measure," Xavier agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. That evening, after the children were asleep, Xavier found Katherine standing by the window in their bedroom, gazing at the stars scattered like diamonds across the Montana sky. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, and she leaned into his embrace, a gesture so familiar and yet still so precious after all these years. "I was thinking," she said softly, "about that day you found me, how close I came to never having all this." She turned in his arms to face him, her expression solemn. "If you hadn't come along that trail at that moment." Xavier touched her cheek gently. But I did, and you were strong enough to survive until I found you." Katherine smiled, the same smile that had captivated him from the moment it first appeared, genuine and unclouded by fear. "We were meant to find each other, I think, across all that wilderness against all odds." "Without a doubt," Xavier agreed, drawing her closer. "Some things are just meant to be." As they held each other in the quiet darkness of the home they had built together, both Katherine and Xavier Nash knew that the greatest justice Thomas Norwood had faced was not his imprisonment or even his death. It was the fact that his attempt to destroy Katherine had ultimately led her to the love that had saved her, the love that had allowed her to become not just a survivor, but a woman who truly thrived. And in the years that followed, as their children grew and eventually brought grandchildren to the ranch, as the seasons turned and time left its gentle marks upon them both, Xavier and Katherine remained each other's steadfast champions, their love a testament to the truth they had discovered in the most unlikely of circumstances, that even from the darkest moments, the most beautiful beginnings can emerge. For Katherine, who had once believed herself beyond hope, and for Xavier, who had once believed himself beyond attachment, their life together was the sweetest form of justice, a love story written not in spite of the past, but because of it. And in Fort Benton, Montana, long after both had passed from this world, leaving behind a legacy of kindness and courage, people still told their story of the cowboy who found a beaten woman in the tall grass and ensured justice was served, not just in a courtroom, but in the creation of a love that healed wounds deeper than any physical blow. It was, those who knew them would say, the greatest love story the territory had ever known.